So if you are familiar with the whole scuttlebutt surrounding this new, woke Dragon Age game, there's a good chance that you have seen this moment. It's a clip that has been making its rounds on social media where a character obliges herself to do a number of push-ups in response to her using an incorrect pronoun, and the scene has received its due ridicule given just how blatantly the writers are leaning in on their propaganda and didacticism. Now, rather than play the whole damn clip for context, I will only reference it since it has been so widely shared. But something that needs to be acknowledged is that this scene remarks upon an already active social phenomenon. You see, a lot of people watching this scene will note the immensity of its ridiculousness, the fact that the character is not acting within character, and of course that the writers are indeed forcing wokeness into the game's story. All this is true and more, yet I do not believe people have really narrowed down what is going on here. Exactly. At least not as elaborately as I would prefer. For to do so would require some introspection and self-criticism. The only person who came closest to talking about this was Smudboy, who made a video referring back to the character Isabella in Dragon Age 2, and he compared her characterization then to what it is now in Veilguard.
She'd argue with Aveline constantly because she was such a prude.
Shut up, whore. That's my go.
The majority of conversations in Dragon Age 2 with her are about sex and innuendo.
The difference between a courtesan and a whore is... well, their shoes are nicer. I think your shoes are fine. Look at you being funny. That might even get you a man someday.
And the only problem I had with Smudboy's analysis was that I believe he could have gone a bit further than simply talking about this as a problem with lore and consistency. There is a purpose to what the writers in Veilguard were doing, and it is sickening. There's a meta-commentary going on here that has a lot to do with Isabella's previous characterization, and one should also keep that in mind with some of the lines the writers gave to this new character, Tosh.
Tosh, do you like being a woman?
Nobody likes being a woman.
It is indeed very telling that a character known for being as erotic and carefree as Isabella would suddenly be subject to an apology ritual in response to Tasha's rejecting her womanhood. In essence, what Isabella is actually apologizing for here is her own capacity for femininity. Yes, indeed, the meta-commentary is that Isabella is apologizing for being a woman. Now, granted that womanhood was illustrated in her flaunting her sexual appeal throughout Dragon Age 2, in ways many would also consider to be deviant.
I do just fine whoring myself out without your help, thanks.
But even that had a purpose to it. As a companion, she was a foil for Aveline, whose cold and stoic demeanor was polar opposite to that of Isabella, and the two would clash with each other over the course of the story. Characters are not perfect, nor necessarily do they need to be, because human beings are also not perfect. And for the entire setting, Isabella's characterization had a way of working within its own right. The reality is that men and women are different from each other. They are different in many important ways, and each sex has an important role to play in the world in accordance with how he or she was born. And so when we talk about wokeness in media, one must also account for the fact that not only is postmodern storytelling an attempt to destroy men and masculinity, but also women and femininity. Yet all of that is being done in a manner that is cold and calculating. It is all being done on purpose. And that all adds to just how infuriating it is to see BioWare use a storyline that many had invested in 15 years ago and turn it into this petty means of destroying culture by attempting to forego the biologically and spiritually ingrained concepts of sex and sexuality. And now all of that brings me to talk about Samus Aran and my recent coverage of that article by Smash JT about the future of Metroid. I received a comment from someone asking me this: does this channel want Samus not being strong and independent? Should she be like the new Lara Croft, always crying, being the second in command, a sidekick to a male protagonist? What kind of point you're trying to make? In Metroid's essence, i.e. a strong woman protagonist in an action role, already goes against your beliefs. Why do you care about the game? I don't get it. So I'm guessing this user had not seen the video prior to this where I covered more of Smash JT's video on Metroid. Regardless, this comment does give me the opportunity to unwind what I had talked about here. In the Smash JT video, I had attempted to draw a line between comments made by Jeff and concepts laid down by critical race theory. If I'm to distill things down in such a way to make them understandable, this is how I would address the whole strong and independent woman attribution which we so often hear nowadays. First, we would have to break down exactly what either word means. Strong as in physical strength or strength of character. Additionally, the word independence begs the question, independence from what? Often independence is presumed to be independence from men, or the patriarchy. That's the feminist angle. And there you have to ask yourself, does that really describe Samus Aran? But don't you see how that presumes there's a political situation in the world of Metroid that the games do not, in the slightest, allude to? When has Metroid ever concerned itself with anything but fantastic weapons, morph balls, alien monsters, and ancient technology? Oh yes, the only time this did happen was Metroid Other M, where we more or less saw how ill-fit political and social commentary was for such a world as wondrous and outlandish as Metroid.
I was not wrong. The humans were foolish, and I was forced to bring judgment on them.
But moving on, the capacity for strength and/or independence are not mutually exclusive to either sex, nor does one's exemplifying either trait set one apart from the other sex in a manner that is exceptional. Next, the purpose of attributing strong and independent to a woman presumes the opposite is default. In other words, using this terminology presumes that strong and independent therefore adheres to a moral ought, but that begs the question where this ought comes from, and why it must be adhered to in the first place. Now let's tie this in with the scene with Isabella's apology ritual in Dragon Age the Veilguard. While in reality we do not have apology rituals as elaborate as doing push-ups for perceived slights, what we do act upon is what I like to call language of appeasement. In the case of strong and independent women, the language of appeasement is positive sexism. The reason we make such statements as, this woman is strong and independent, is because we are appeasing the perception that women are oppressed and their default state is anything other than strong and independent. And so when looking at worthwhile attributes of a female protagonist in a video game, for example, the terms strong and independent are attributed as exceptional, which means by proxy, unexceptional women are not strong and are not independent. And that is important to keep in mind because it works into the critical race theory angle, which was expertly illustrated in Disney's Zootopia.
You know, it burns me up to see folks with such backward attitudes toward foxes. You're a great dad and just a real articulate fella.
It's rare that I find someone so non-patronizing.
So Judy Hopps, the rabbit character, has found it necessary to use terms of appeasement to patronize Nick Wilde, the fox character. And you see, even while she is complimenting him, she is also necessarily disparaging any fox who isn't him. In other words, by saying someone exists outside a particular stereotype, we therefore validate the existence of said stereotype, which therefore means that language of appeasement is inherently racist or sexist, despite intending not to be. You know, part of the reason I was also reminded of Zootopia and Judy's patronizing Nick here is the fact that Reddit's own user base found it appropriate to post an hero hotline for anyone contemplating Minecrafting themselves over Donald Trump winning the 2024 election. That post has got to be the most patronizing gesture possible, even to people who are in serious contemplation of self-harm. They would have to concede as to how incredibly disingenuous that is. But the key takeaway here is remarking on this person's propensity to patronize others, and therefore lord over them. But now ask yourselves this question: why am I constantly being made to bend the knee and appease these people? Why do I agree with them when they tell me I have these unconscious biases while they, unabashedly, flaunt their own? Often, when people are about to make broad statements about so-called marginalized groups, they go through their own apology rituals through language of appeasement. If one observes patterns of behavior, for instance, one precursors an observation with, I don't want to be racist, but, or, I don't hate gay people, but, and so on and so forth. Moreover, even after one makes an observation, or even says an absolute true statement, at times one finds it appropriate to follow up with, I have a lot of black friends, or some of my best friends are gay, or my wife also agrees with me. All of this is language of appeasement. Language that necessarily leans into self-inflicted guilt for thoughts we do not have. And so this is a far less elaborate means of doing 10 push-ups for simply telling the truth, but in effect, these sentiments are identical. And this is how we can be corralled and controlled by things like DEI. We have submitted ourselves to a world where individuals now represent entire social groups, and we have also been made to agree to having biases that we are not even consciously aware of. Frankly, in a grand effort to sequester ourselves from racism and sexism, we have therefore enslaved ourselves to forever use language that acknowledges race and sex, and also compels us to forever think about race and sex. The want not to be racist and sexist has only made us even more racist and sexist. And amidst all of it, the aspects that supposedly make these special groups special in the first place is slowly being eradicated. In other words, it doesn't even matter that Isabella is a female because eventually even the objective value of womanhood will have to be done away with in the wake of the new.
So, I'm non-binary.
So to the point, mandating special treatment to people based on their so-called marginalized statuses is fundamentally ridiculous and not only devalues people as individuals, but also compromises our own capacity to be objective and to tell the truth. So we can point and laugh and criticize Isabella's silly apology ritual here, but we also can't deny that this is an apt illustration of how our victimocracy works and how we readily submit ourselves to its whims. Whenever you try to use language of appeasement, you will be seen as self-reporting.
But also featuring a female protagonist and being one of the first games in history to do such a thing and bringing it to such prominence.
I like, I brought it up in past videos, but like Final Fantasy 16 has a kissing scene with 2 guys. It was great. I mean, like, not like I was like, oh, this is, but like, it was a great scene because it was a great story and it was a great moment in that story and it made sense with the rest of the game.
Granted, you might not even realize that you're doing it. It might just be something you have fallen into involuntarily, but that really won't matter because it begs the question what other modes of behavior you have fallen into. Ultimately, you will not be trusted. But also granted, these modes of behavior have become survival mechanisms in this day and age. You don't want to offend. You want to keep the peace. You want to maintain harmony with your fellow man, etc. But how far do you let that go? At what point do you acknowledge enough is enough? At this point in time, a lot of people are withdrawing from regular human interaction. They're refusing to go outside. They're cutting off relationships. Above all, we also note there's an immense disparity between men and women. This all might be easy to chalk up to what happened in 2020, but the fact of the matter is a lot of our current state has been built up over a longer period. And the reality is much of this has resulted in the way that language has been and continues to be confined and strangled. If you continually wrap people up in this exhausting game of maintaining both honesty and dishonesty at the same time, then that's where your society will unravel. All interactions will become artificial. People will become trapped in fake versions of themselves, where every smile, every laugh, every act of kindness, and every word of encouragement is forced. And if you know deep down in your heart that there is something wrong in the world, but are still compelled by forces outside yourself to tie your tongue, what effect will that have in the long run? The best word I have heard to describe this environment is toxic positivity, and that environment will inevitably lead to people becoming fed up with each other, as we're all made to jump through Clown World's seemingly endless hoops. Frankly, if people know that they are going to have to continually be made to pay the pulling a barve tax over and over and over again in a grand effort to communicate with one of the progressive elite's chosen people, well, then naturally they won't want to be obliged to continue having human interactions. And so they'll stay at home. In cases where sexual degenerates are begging for approval, a lack of human interaction may actually be a good thing. Now, one final thing I wanted to add with regard to the 2024 election and Donald Trump's win was Reddit breaking out in fits of bigotry. Now, clever onlookers will witness this happen, and They'll say things like, oh, look, these guys, they're the real racists. And yes, true. But look beyond the hypocrisy for a moment. Do not fall into the trap of assuming that racism is even wrong-headed in the first place, because inherently it isn't. For what is racism but observation and pattern recognition? It is objective reality, and therefore the only thing that would be unnatural about racism is being made to feel guilty about it. And of course, the same goes for sexism. Men and women are different, and acknowledging that is good and natural. The problem with racism and sexism, as the words are colloquially understood, is that we attribute undeserved moral value to a person's race or sex. And unfortunately, this is also granted to those whose identity is tied to sexual degeneracy. Now, whether those values be positive or negative, the fact of the matter is all of it is undeserved. Moral value is and always has been an attribute consigned to the individual and to individual behavior. It ought not be given to those who award themselves karma simply for existing within an identity.